Talked about yesterday. Do you remember the last thing we talked about yesterday?
It was when Arthur, he carried on the presidency like he believed it would be run
By Garfield, because he was so upset about what Guiteau yelled at the assassination. Very good, okay. Well, we're going to move on to the election of 1884, and our president is Chester Arthur, who inherited the president with the assassination of James Garfield. And prior to the election of 1884, President Arthur made it really clear that he wanted to run for his own term. Now, he won't be running for re-election because he was never elected. So what he's doing is he's running for his own term. Okay, and he said he was interested. Well, at the time, he had a fatal kidney condition that he was not aware of. So he made it really clear that he wanted to run for his own term, not re-election, but his own term. But what he didn't know at the time is he had a fatal kidney condition that was going to get him soon. Okay? Now, do you think that he got the Republican nomination? Why? Why didn't he?
The stalwarts all over him.
Yeah, the stalwarts were all over him because instead of doing what they thought he should do from the stalwart perspective, he continued all the programs by Garfield. So the Republican Party had no use for him. So they nominated a familiar name, James G. Blaine, for the presidency. Okay? So James G. Blaine was the nominee. Now, I guess to be honest with you, if Arthur would have been the nominee, he ended up dying in 1886 at the age of 56, and if he'd have got the nomination, he would have died in office. Okay, so we would have had another, vice president have to succeed the presidency. Nobody knew that at the time, but that was the case. So the Republicans will go with James G. Blaine for the presidency. But again, the Republicans weren't happy. All of the Republicans were not happy with that selection. The Republican Party, member, is pretty fragmented. And many of the Republicans were unhappy with that choice of James G. Blaine. And so the Republican Party split. And the ones that were unhappy with James G. Blaine's nomination formed a group, not a party, but they formed a group called the Mugwumps, which is on your ID sheet. So again, Republicans that were not thrilled with the nomination of James G. Blaine split up and formed a group, okay, thank you, by the name of the Mugwumps. Now, despite their differences, this group did not nominate their own candidate for president, okay? But they're going to have an effect in the election because they're not happy with Blaine's. Okay? So, we'll move on and tell you that the Democratic Party nominated a fellow by the name of Grover Cleveland for the presidency, and he was a former governor of New York. So, for the Republicans, you're going to have James G. Blaine, and the Republicans that are not happy with that nomination have formed a group called the Mugwumps, but they did not name their own candidate. They just stayed and watched. The Democrats countered with former governor of New York, Grover Cleveland. Well, what are the Mugwumps going to protest? How are they going to show their protest in this election?
The Republican nominee.
How are they going to show their protest, though, in the election? They're going to throw their votes to the Democratic candidate, Cleveland. That's what they threatened. And even though they threatened that, this really was a pretty close campaign throughout. And many people thought Blaine would have a chance to beat Cleveland despite all this controversy. Well, unfortunately, something happened on election eve. The night before the general election, something happened that really hurt James Blaine. This is where you got to kind of be careful who your friends and supporters are, because what happened is one of Blaine's well-known supporters referred to the Democratic Party as rum, Romanism, and rebellion. One of Blaine's close advisors, close supporters, said publicly that the Democratic Party, now that was the opposite party, he referred to him as rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Rum, Romanism, and rebellion. That's a criticism that one of James G. Blaine's big-time supporters stated on election eve. That the Democrats were nothing but rum, Romanism, and rebellion. What's that mean?
We call them drunkards.
Drunkards,
Immoral.
immoral, rebellious. What does Romanism mean? Well, but who is that going to offend? You're damn right, excuse me. You're going to offend Catholics, right? And so what did the Republican Catholics do the next day in the election? They voted for Cleveland. Killed him. He had a shot until one of his close supporters referred to the Democratic Party as rum, Romanism, and rebellion. And that statement angered all Catholics, even those that were Republican. And so they voted Democrat in this election. And as a result of that blunder, Grover Cleveland wins the election of 1884, earning 219 votes to Blaine's 182. But is it a close election? Yeah, it's close. So does that tell you that Blaine could have certainly won without this, quote, help by his supporter? Through the election to Grover Cleveland without doubt. Now this is kind of interesting, because who's won all these presidential elections for like ever? Yeah, this is the first Democratic win in a presidential election in 28 years. We're going to have our first Democratic president in 28 years. If you divide that by 4 years of a term, that's a long time, right? That's like 7 elections. Okay? So the Democrats have gotten beat. This will be the first presidential victory for the Democrats in 28 years. Anybody want to guess who was the last Democrat to be in the White House? Okay, where are we at? We're right here. Here's Chester Arthur. Republican, 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 Grant, Republican, Republican, Republican. James Buchanan was the last Democratic president. Because Johnson wasn't elected, was he? Okay?
I feel like they were getting more scored up for party names with where they went to half breeds.
Well, that's not party names, those are groups. Member groups. Yeah. Why do people listen to Justin Bieber? I mean, it's a good question. All right. 1856 was the last Democratic president. Okay. Grover Cleveland had some important laws passed during his presidency, and that's our next subtopic. Important legislation passed under the presidency of Grover Cleveland. I'm going to give you some different laws that were passed that were important. So he had a little better presidency. Passed some important acts. You tell me if you think they're important. 3 I'm going to give you that were of significance. What was the first one, Kyle?
The Presidential Secession Act of 1886.
Perfect. Presidential Secession Act of 1886. What do you think that did?
Limit the term.
No, good guess, but no. Go ahead, Will.
Did it ban the secession of...
Not secession, succession.
Oh.
Somebody is going to, if somebody happens to them, they're going to do what? Okay, right now, what's the presidential succession? If the president dies, who takes over? Vice president. But what happens if the president and the vice president? Well, that's what it is now, but this act stated that if both the president and vice president died or became disabled, the cabinet members would succeed to the presidency in the order in which their offices were created. Okay? So what is it today? Anybody know? Who's in line if the president and vice president go down the tubes?
Secretary of State, Speaker.
It's the Speaker of the House.
It's the Speaker of the House, not the Secretary of State. So has the rule changed since then?
Yeah, but can you repeat that really?
Okay, what it said in this act is that if the president and vice president both died or became disabled, that the order to the presidency would be in the order in which the cabinet positions were established. So you're telling me, Blaine, that if the president and the vice president become dead or disabled, it goes to the Speaker of the House? Would you bet your life on it? Yeah, he's right. We had a situation when Ronald Reagan was shot in the 80s. Alexander Haig was the Secretary of State, and they couldn't find the vice president right away, and so he said publicly, I'm in charge now. He said that publicly and just got butchered for it because they thought this guy is the Secretary of State and doesn't even know the order of presidential succession. Okay? So he's right. Blaine's right. It's the Speaker of the House. That wasn't what it was then. Maybe. I don't know. Okay? Was the Secretary of State established before the Speaker of the House in those days? Was it when we first did our cabinets? Did we talk about a Speaker of the House when we talked about the first presidential cabinet? No. So it's changed. But that's what the law stated. Because they were concerned. They had a presidential assassination, and they thought, well, God, what would we have done if Chester Arthur would have kicked over of a heart attack? Who would take it over then? That's what the law did. That was passed under Cleveland. Second one was the Electoral Count Act of 1887. What problem is this going to solve, Bailey? The Electoral Count Act of 1887. It's not to solve a problem. Well, yeah, but think about the election we had that was a problem. What was the problem with that election?
When those 4 states.
Sent in what?
Yeah.
2 sets of returns. Well, what the Electoral Count Act of 1887 stated, that if a state ever sent in more than 1 set of returns, the set of returns that would be counted would be the one that the governor of that state approved. So in this case, if 2 sets of returns were set in, the governor would look at both sets, and then he would say, I'm okay in this set to go in. Okay? That's what that stated. That the law provided a solution if a state sent in more than 1 set of returns in an election. In this case, the set of returns that would be approved by the governor of that state would be the official one. So that solved that problem. Now, the other one was called the Interstate Commerce Act. And I don't want you to think that this established interstates across the country, because that didn't happen until the Eisenhower administration in the 50s. But the Interstate Commerce Act that was passed during the presidency of Grover Cleveland was a law that set up ways to improve relations between railroads, small businesses, and farmers. So the Interstate Commerce Act was an act that was passed to set up ways to improve relations between railroads, small businesses, and farmers. So, did Grover Cleveland have a somewhat productive 4 years in office? He really did. Okay? So let's talk about the election of 1888 now. Let's move on to that election. Now, the Democrats were pleased with Cleveland, so what did they do? They nominated him for re-election. Okay? So Cleveland will run for re-election for the Democratic Party. The Republican nominee will be Benjamin Harrison, who ironically was the grandson of former President William Henry Harrison. Remember the guy that died of pneumonia like shortly after his inauguration? He gave a real long, lengthy speech in a rainstorm and got sick and died in office. Okay, well, this was his grandson, Benjamin Harrison. Not really well known, but that's who the Republicans nominated. So it'll be President Cleveland for the Democrats. Republican nominee was Benjamin Harrison. Now, this is an interesting election because President Cleveland won the popular vote by over 100,000 votes. He won the popular vote by over 100,000 votes. But as we've said many times, popular vote and $1.25 or whatever will buy you a pop down at the pop machine. In the Electoral College, Harrison was the winner, 233 to 168. So with that, he becomes President of the United States after losing the popular vote. 100,000 more people in this country wanted Grover Cleveland, but yet he is not the president. And that goes back to our conversation of Wyoming, which is worth 3 electoral votes. If everybody in Wyoming except for Shania McGarvin votes for me, and she votes for Taylor, I still only get 3 electoral votes, and that's how it matters. And so this was the first election in a long time that happened where the popular vote did not result in the winner. The one we talked about before resulted in a deal, not an election. Remember that we talked about before? So, Benjamin Harrison will be president. Now I'm going to give you a profile on him. Benjamin Harrison. Where is Benjamin Harrison? Anybody know? He's right here? Okay. Well, Benjamin Harrison was born in 1833 in North Bend, Ohio. Benjamin Harrison was born in 1833 in North Bend, Ohio. Now, this is kind of interesting. Benjamin Harrison was named after his great-grandfather, who was one of the original signers of what? The Declaration of Independence. So Benjamin Harrison was the great-grandson of a man who signed the Declaration of Independence. His great-grandfather signed the Declaration. So you have a little history behind it. He was the second born of 10 children in his family. He was the second born of 10 children. So he went to elementary school, and he went through high school, and he graduated from high school, and he went to Farmers College in Farmers Hill, Ohio. Didn't mean it was a college for farmers. It was called Farmers College in Farmers Hill, Ohio, and he went there for 3 years. Did not complete his degree there. He's going to transfer. We'll tell you about that. So he attends Farmers College in Farmers Hill, Ohio for 3 years. When he was a freshman there, he met his future wife, Caroline Scott. Met his future wife, Caroline Scott, as a freshman at Farmers College. They eventually married and had 2 children, a boy and a girl. And he transferred then from Farmers College to Miami of Ohio University. You know who's a good football player that played there? You football guys here? Who? I think this is where he played, I'm pretty sure. Quarterback's the Steelers. Ben Roethlisberger, I believe, is a Miami of Ohio graduate. I'll have to look that up. Well, anyway, he went to Miami of Ohio and earned a law degree there. Harrison did. So he transfers from Farmers College. He goes to Miami of Ohio University, earns a law degree. And then what do you have to do after you earn your law degree? You have to pass a bar exam, which he did. And he actually won his first big case as a lawyer. So it's off to a good start. So he graduates from Miami of Ohio with a law degree. He passes his bar exam to become a lawyer. He even wins his first big case. Well, he was a deeply religious man. He taught Sunday school, became the deacon of his local Presbyterian church. And he served in the Civil War. Which side do you think he served in? He served in the North. Okay, so like most at the time, he served in the Civil War in the North. Now, he earned the nickname in the Civil War, Little Ben. He earned the nickname Little Ben from his men that were under his command. Why did he get the name Little Ben?
He was small.
He was 5'6" tall is all. So they gave him Little Ben. Well, after the Civil War, he ran for governor of Indiana, but was defeated. So after the Civil War, Benjamin Harrison ran for governor of Indiana, but was defeated. A few years later, he was offered a cabinet appointment by President Garfield. President Garfield actually asked him to be in his cabinet, but he turned him down. And the reason he turned him down is because he had just been elected to what, do you think? Keep close, part of it, the United States Senate in 1881. So after he unsuccessfully ran for governor of Indiana, he was actually offered a cabinet appointment by President Garfield, and he turned it down because in 1881, he was elected to the United States Senate. And I'm going to tell you about two important laws that were passed during his presidential administration. The first one you might have heard of, it was called the Sherman Antitrust Act. You know what a trust is? What's a trust, Taylor? It's a money thing. There's a lot of different trusts. Some people put a trust together to put money in for their children to inherit. Another thing a trust could be is money that's pooled together by businesses, okay? And when big businesses form trusts, what do they get to do? If you have a big business, what do you get to do? Okay, let me see if I can make it. Okay, so let me see if I can make this. Warland might be a good example of this in a way. Okay, so Pepsi's a pretty big company, right? I'm assuming they must have a trust. And then Pepsi sets the prices for their product, right? So